Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can't say that I'm happy to be rising today to be discussing this piece of legislation, but I am happy to be rising today as a law-abiding firearms owner to defend my fellow law-abiding firearms owners. How did we get here, Mr. Speaker? And I'll just put things in context so people who might be watching at home know who they're listening to. I'm a member of Parliament from an urban-rural split riding in central Alberta. Half my constituents live in the third largest city in Alberta, Red Deer, and the other half of my constituents live either on a First Nations reserve or in a rural setting in either the county of Red Deer, county of Lacombe, county of Ponoka, or in a small town, city, or village therein. We are, I would consider the people that I represent to be honest, hardworking, law-abiding folk that just want their tax dollars spent wisely, and they want the freedom to pursue whatever it is in life that they want to pursue, and many of them pursue various things that involve firearms, including hunting. Farmers, like on the farm that I grew up on, where firearms were just a tool, an everyday part of life, and for those who want to participate, of course, in sport shooting. This is very, very popular in my constituency. There are numerous stores and vendors in central Alberta that supply firearms and ammunition and parts because of the demand that's there. And I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, we do not have the problems that my colleague who just spoke talked about in her large urban center, because we respect the law. We put in place policies at both the provincial level, and when we are in the governing party, we put laws in place that actually crack down on criminals. That is where the actual issue lies. I can assure Canadians who might be watching at home that the firearms that I own are doing nothing right now. They don't do anything until someone picks them up. And the issue at hand is violent crime and who is having access to firearms. And there are many numerous provisions in this bill, Bill C-21, that do not actually address or penalize or are in any way going to affect that outcome of dealing with the wrong people getting a hold of firearms. So how did we get here? Over the course of the decades that have preceded, Canada has been a country that has been a rugged place to settle, a rugged place still for some who live in rural areas or adjacent to wild areas, who are farming, who are doing forestry, who are doing something as seemingly innocuous as keeping beehives. I should note that anybody at home watches or grew up with cartoon books. Winnie the Pooh was addicted to honey. This is not by chance. Bears often frequent these places, and good, honest people have bought firearms to protect themselves, many of which are caught up in the Order in Council that came a number of years ago. But it all started years ago in the 1930s. If we go back just that far, every single firearm, every single handgun in this country has been put in a registry, but that doesn't stop criminals from obtaining guns illegally. But again, the government of the day, whenever it's a government that's liberal or liberal-leaning, we seem to want to blame the law-abiding citizen. So we've had a registry for decades when it comes to firearms. The government knows where all the lawfully owned handguns in this country actually are. We've had changes that have been made back when Jean Chrétien was the Prime Minister, changes that were brought in, including a long gun registry that was wasteful and ineffective. The government of the day said it would only cost $2 million. It was actually closer to $2 billion, and of course didn't do anything to address violent crime. We've seen this government in its first mandate put in place a bill, C-75, which basically codified in law bail provisions that would let people out with in the soonest amount of time with the least amount of restrictions, and now we see what's happened with that. So Bill C-21, what did it originally do? When the members of this House were actually invited to speak to Bill C-21, it was simply the codification law of an order in council to ban the transfer of handguns. Then sneakily, the government decided to table drop back in November a huge stack of amendments that had absolutely nothing to do with handguns. They were all about long guns, and of course the government bit off far more than it could chew. It managed to alienate almost all of its voting base when it comes to Indigenous Canadians who were offended by the fact that the firearms that are used by Indigenous people were largely going to be caught up in Amendment G46, taking away their ability to use that firearm. It also there was an evergreen clause that they called it in G4, I'm sorry to report, Mr. Speaker, that it's just a new evergreen clause that they put in place. It virtually does the same thing with a small minor exception, but I'll explain in a few minutes when we get back to that what the problem actually is with the government's notions going forward on their new evergreen clause. But, and we all remember, Mr. Speaker, this government's, it was pretty obvious what had happened because we heard the recordings in the Mass Casualty Commission, a government that actually interfered. They took this mass casualty event in Nova Scotia, and they actually interfered in the investigation by demanding that the officers who were investigating that at the time turn over information to advance a political agenda of the government of the day. So we know that it's not about evidence. It's not evidence-based policy making. It's policy-based evidence making and evidence finding, even if it interferes with a police investigation. And that's why there is very little trust as a law-abiding firearms owner in what the intentions of a Liberal government supported by the NDP is doing. What is the problem, Mr. Speaker? The problem is violent crime. In the last 8 years, because of the provisions that have been passed by this government when they had a majority and with the support of other left-leaning parties in this place, they have passed numerous pieces of legislation, Bill C-75, Bill C-5, that have basically eliminated any consequences whatsoever for people who commit crime. So much so that violent crime in the last 8 years is up 32 or 34%? 32% over what it was when this Prime Minister and his government inherited the government offices of this place. But more astonishingly, Mr. Speaker, is this number. 94% increase in gang-related homicides. 94. You would think that an almost doubling of the amount of homicides by gang members would actually trigger a response from the government to crack down on organized crime, but they actually have done the opposite. The passages and clauses in the criminal code that would deal with people who are repeat violent offenders have largely been removed. Any semblance of a minimum sentence, and I'm not even talking about mandatory minimum sentences put in place by Stephen Harper when he was the Prime Minister. By the way, crime went down over those 10 years, Mr. Speaker. But I'm getting to the point of the fact that numerous minimum or just the basic minimum sentences, they weren't even called because they were put in place by people like Pierre Elliott Trudeau and Jean Chrétien. Of the 12 firearms-related clauses in that piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker, 11 of them were actually put in place by previous Liberal governments, and this version of the Liberal government has actually removed even the most basic minimum sentences for violent crime, including smuggling, including shooting with, firing a gun irresponsibly, or even holding a gun to somebody's head for the purpose of extortion. They've removed any mandatory jail time whatsoever. So that's the tone and that's the signal that they've sent to the country. So why, of course, would a criminal not want to increase their activity? There are no consequences. And this is the problem. And I'll give you an example of the illogic of what the government is actually doing right now. According to the RCMP on their website, there are approximately 430 gangs in Canada with 7,000 members in those gangs. And if you look over the last 5 or 6 years at the average number of homicides committed by people associated with gangs, it's about 50% of the murders are committed by gang members, about 125 a year. There are 2.2 million licensed gun owners in this country who, if you look over that same time period, you would see they would be charged for homicide about 12 times a year. 12 out of 2.2 million versus 125 out of 7,000 people. And who does this government go after? The 2.2 million. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. If you do the math, a gang member is 3,300 times more likely to commit murder with a firearm than a law-abiding firearms owner is. And yet this government only focuses on the law-abiding firearms owner. Gary Mauser, Professor Emeritus, did an analysis of Stats Can that Canadians that don't have a license, so I'm talking about Canadians that aren't licensed firearms owners, are still 3 times more likely to commit a homicide than a vetted, licensed gun owner is. So to the people who are watching at home, the safest people in Canada for you to be with are legally vetted, law-abiding firearms owners who at any time can have their firearms taken away with any complaint lodged against them, which means that every firearm owner meticulously follows the laws of storage, follows the laws of transportation, follows the laws when it comes to safe discharge. As a matter of fact, we jokingly quip sometimes that gun control means making sure your muzzle is always pointed downrange. That's what gun control is to a law-abiding gun owner. We follow all of the rules because we don't want to risk losing our privileges. Because here's the fact, Mr. Speaker. Every firearm in Canada is illegal unless it's in the possession of somebody with a license who is authorized to have that firearm. And we have to go through a renewal process every 5 years where our entire history, our mental health history, our medical history, anything that might have happened before the courts is reviewed in detail. And we wait months to get that license renewed. Sometimes it's not renewed on time, which puts us in a situation as law-abiding firearms owners where we're now in possession of our firearms, where we were legal one day, and because of the incompetence of the government to be able to process an application on time, we are now illegally in possession, technically according to the law, illegally in possession of firearms. We actually had a clause back when Stephen Harper was the Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker, where we actually gave a 6-month grace period to people. And I am very frustrated, Mr. Speaker, and I'll get to that in a minute. Very, very frustrated with the removal of that grace period. But from committee, Dr. Kaylin Langman from McMaster basically laid it out for everybody to see. The foregoing research papers are peer-reviewed and conclude that Canadian legislation to regulate and control firearm possession and acquisition does not have a corresponding effect on homicide and suicide rates. I was asked to produce a review paper for the Journal of Preventative Medicine in 2021. This paper, entitled Suicide, Firearms and Legislation, a review of the Canadian evidence, reviewed 13 studies regarding suicide and legislative efforts and found an associated reduction in suicide by firearm in men aged 45 and older, but demonstrated an equivalent increase in suicide by other methods such as hanging. Factors such as unemployment, low income, and Indigenous populations were associated with suicide rates. My conclusions are based on sound statistical analysis and information specifically related to Canada. I am not aware of any other Canadian research which uses reliable statistical models to dispute or disagree with my conclusions. Bans of military-appearing firearms, semi-automatic rifles and handguns, short-barrel handguns, and Saturday night specials in the 1990s has resulted in no associated reduction in homicide rates. To summarize the results, no statistically significant beneficial associations were found between firearms legislation and homicide by firearm, as well as spousal homicide by firearms and the criminal charge of discharge of a firearm with intent. Other studies have demonstrated agreement with my studies that laws targeting restricted firearms, such as handguns and certain semi-automatic and full automatic firearms in Canada, also had no associated effect with homicide rates. Canadian studies by Leaners and Lester, Mauser and Holmes, and McPhader and Mauser in 2013 are all in general agreement with this study, Mr. Speaker. The issue is violent crime. That is about controlling violent criminals and controlling those people. You can control inanimate objects all you want, but it will not change anything. So who isn't the problem, Mr. Speaker? It's not hunters. Over 8 million people in this country hunt and fish, contributing $19 billion annually to the GDP. And the Order in Council has already banned rifles used for hunting, some that even conservation officers use. I was a conservation officer, Mr. Speaker. I was a national park warden, and I was issued firearms for my duties. I was a park ranger in the province of Alberta. I was issued firearms for those duties as well, including when I was the ranger in charge of a park. Every person I dealt with as a conservation officer was at least a camper that had an axe, a fisherman that had a knife, or a hunter that either had a rifle or a bow and arrow. I had no trouble with those good people. No trouble whatsoever. And to ban the very guns that conservation officers use, they don't have those firearms. The Yukon government actually had to go around the Order in Council to buy firearms for their conservation officers because those were the best firearms available to protect their officers from bears, from mountain lions, and from all of the other issues that conservation officers face, because that's where the real issue lies. And it's very, very clear as a hunter, Mr. Speaker, and with the changes that they've made, it's weasel words, Mr. Speaker, especially the clause that still deals in the evergreening clause that deals with magazines. I laid it out very clearly at committee that anybody who wants to interpret that the way they want to can say that as long as that firearm can take a magazine that holds more than 5 rounds, it shall be banned. We are going to end up in a situation, after this becomes law, where guns that are functionally identical, one's from 10 years ago and one is a new firearm, one will be prohibited and the other will still be legal because of the clear lack of knowledge and understanding that non-gun owners have when it comes to firearms, making laws that simply don't work. We're going to have that scenario again. But wait. If you think your gun was saved because you have an older gun that's not included in the new evergreening clause, think again, because the firearms committee that they're going to strike is going to still have the same authority to do a firearms reference table analysis and ban whatever guns they don't like. And I got news for everybody in this room. A hunting rifle is any rifle, and if you take a look at all of the hunting regulations in all of the provinces and territories in this country, a hunting rifle is a rifle that's in the hands of a hunter, used for the purpose of the hunt. Doesn't matter what it looks like. It just matters what the caliber of the bullet is so that you can safely dispatch the animal. And I could go on, Mr. Speaker. I could literally go on for a couple more hours and talk about the end of cowboy-mounted shooting, cowboy action shooting, IPSC, all of these sports, all of these good people, mostly Filipinos, by the way, when I go to an IPSC event, people who have moved here from a country that never allowed them to actually own a firearm, have come here and taken up this sport and this activity, Mr. Speaker, and they're frustrated because when you take away the ability to transfer these handguns between law-abiding citizens, it'll be the end of thousands of people's enjoyment of the sports that involve handguns, Mr. Speaker. I look forward to answering, hopefully, some logical questions from around this room. Oh, can I move an amendment?
Please.
And before I end, Mr. Speaker, I move, seconded by the member for Selkirk Interlake Eastman, that the motion be amended by deleting all the words after the word that and substituting the following. Bill C-21, an act to amend certain acts and to make certain consequential amendments. Firearms be not now read a third time, but referred back to the Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security for the purpose of reconsidering clauses 0.1, 1.1, and 17 with a view to ensure that the government cannot take away hunting rifles from law-abiding farmers, hunters, and Indigenous peoples. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.